course, we want to say thank you and express so much gratitude to our presenting sponsors. You see their logos in front of you on the screen. We are just, really constantly amazed by their support, and not just for the two of us, but in the nonprofit show, but really the sector at large. So thank you to our presenting sponsors that have continued to make this show happen. And of course, to Julia Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. Thankfully, she thought of this show back in March. We called it the Corona Chronicles, and it is going strong. We will be recording and airing live, of course, our 200th show this month. I know, I cannot believe it. And I am so fortunate to continue to serve alongside Julia as her co-host, Jarrett Ransom, the nonprofit nerd, CEO of the Raven Group. And back today, by popular demand, we have Tara Bethel, CEO of Copper Coil Consulting. It's so good to see you again, Tara. Thank you for joining us. And today's show topic might be something that you would have never thought we would have talked about. But in light of our most recent, politics and voting and everything kind of changing around the world, we thought that this was a really good topic to discuss as it pertains to our sector. Welcome, Tara.
Thanks so much, ladies. It's great to be here with you again and with all of your viewers. The show is just growing and just getting more amazing every day. So keep it up.
Well, Tara, yeah, go ahead, Tara. I mean, this is such a huge topic, and I want to warn everyone, we're only a 30-minute show. So this is,
right,
going to be tough. But talk to us just in general about this whole concept.
You got it. And first, a disclaimer. I'm an HR professional, not an attorney. Just want to throw that out there. So feel free to double check anything that I share with your employment law attorney of choice. So I want to share a couple of statistics to get us going. And marijuana, whether you're for it or against it, it is really looking like it is here to stay. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, in the recent election, 5 more states passed marijuana laws. So it's still illegal under federal law. However, the state momentum continues to grow. So in November last month, we had 3 states, Arizona, Montana, and New Jersey, passed recreational marijuana laws for their states. And then Mississippi passed medical marijuana. And then South Dakota just went for it and passed both recreational and medical use marijuana law together this year. So now that brings the total up to 35 states in the US have medical marijuana laws, right? And then 15 states plus the District of Columbia have recreational marijuana laws in effect now.
And so when you said, Tara, and I know we're going to dive deep into this, it is still illegal federally. I'm very aware of if you're, a federally funded organization, this is of great concern. So how are you really navigating this as an HR, consultant and leader in this sector?
Well, that's the big thing that I need to pin down with my clients is, do you receive federal funds? And if so, is it in all of your programs or is it specific programs?
Okay.
Because you can prohibit use for employees of certain programs, but not necessarily all of your staff, like general administrative or ones that cross department boundaries. So that's definitely one of the nuances that's going to impact nonprofit organizations.
I did not know that. I thought it was one full umbrella, policy.
Okay, so wait a minute. You would have to go back in and define which programs or which parts of your federal contracting is actually active, and then you would tag the staffing to that project.
Correct. Let me give you an example. So I used to work for a continuing care retirement community.
Okay.
So in the skilled nursing program, you have registered nurses, certified nursing assistants, people that work exclusively in that program, and they receive Medicare funds. So that can be prohibited, both the medical use and the recreational use. The important thing is once you determine that a job is safety sensitive, you need to put that in the job description. We'll talk about that more, but you need to put it in the job description, make sure the employee is aware of it, signs it, and you have to treat everyone consistently that's in that role of nurse or CNA. Now, if you move into HR representative who's a desk jockey and might support, nurses, aides, and nurses occasionally, but also does work in other non-licensed, non-federally funded areas, that's a little bit different situation. So someone like me would not be in charge of patient care. So do you need to accommodate me? Can you prohibit me? Those are the things we need to ferret out. However, it's probably not that dangerous for me to use my laptop, my copying machine, walking building to building, or working from my home. So it's going to be harder to prohibit someone like me who's in that administrative category.
Wow.
I know. My brain is already, exploding. So how different is this from, using prescription drugs or even alcohol on the job?
Right. And that's how I would recommend people think of this, is thinking about recreational marijuana, like alcohol use. So you're still going to be able to test people if they appear to be impaired in some way. We can get into details on that. And folks still can't, be driving into work and smoking or vaping marijuana products, or they clock out, they get in their car and they're driving on their property and leaving and they're, vaping and whatnot. So, that would just be a huge safety concern. So there's still things you can do to prohibit it. The selling, storing, stashing, sharing, having on your property, those rules still apply for recreational marijuana, just like they would for alcohol.
Okay, so then let's have the discussion about how you begin to even figure this out, because it seems to me that in all of our states, we have different things going on. And until the federal government sets an umbrella policy, it's kind of like the Wild West, right?
Right. And every state has different statutes. So that's where I would start, is pull your revised statutes for your state and look at your new marijuana laws. Plus, if you had any past one, like for medical marijuana laws, look at both of those and copy and paste a lot of that verbiage directly into your policies. So then there can't be any misinterpretation of the information. And then also I would link in your policies to that information as well. So it's handy. So because it's not something that HR and managers are going to think about every single day. However, you want it handy should you have an issue, because a lot of times if you're worried about impairment, you want to go right to the policy and know what to do and where's the information so that you don't botch any of these steps and inadvertently do something that doesn't protect the employee, the clients, and or the employer.
And the contracting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the funding. It's such a multi-layer issue right now, and it's going to be a little bit of a conundrum for a lot of organizations until it seems to me like we have more of a national policy.
Correct. And the other thing too is if you're a multi-state employer, you've got to look at each of those sets of regulations and you've got to operate within each of those structures. So, again, whether you're for it or against it, this is an administrative nightmare for HR people across the U.S. for sure.
Well, and I was going to ask Tara, what is your recommendation for reviewing HR policies altogether? So nothing even related to any new, medical or recreational drugs, but just in general, how often should we be looking at our HR policies?
I would love to see organizations do it annually. Like I love that quiet week, usually between Christmas and New Year's, to look at those, update anything. And then also there could be ad hoc things that come into play middle of the year. Mm-hmm. Like we've seen paid sick time laws in different states, and we've seen the marijuana laws in different states at different times. There's other movements around being able to wear your hair and all kinds of different natural, cultural variations and those kinds of things, and those get updated throughout the year. So, and then if there's a Supreme Court decision, I would update that specific policy. But for a general policy audit, I would do it annually at least.
Wow.
Kudos to you, Tara, and to all the other HR professionals out there, because it sounds like a nightmare for me. I mean, that is not where my brain goes with all of these, fine details, but I'm so glad to know that there are experts out there like you to really help with this.
That's stunning. Okay, now part of that policy issue is drug testing. And so talk to us a little bit more about that. And again, this just seems to me like a moving, a bouncing ball that's just kind of going all over the place. So what are your thoughts and guidance that we should be looking at right now?
Sure. So if you have a drug and alcohol policy currently that includes medical marijuana, you probably won't have to do too much updating. If medical marijuana is new to you, your organization, and you've never dealt with it before, I would reach out to your workers' compensation carrier or broker, and they might have a really good template you can start with from for your state. And then also they might even give you a good premium discount for including certain things around testing circumstances and regulations regarding that. So you can still use a lot of the same language. The things you'll need to update are when you do pre-employment screening, are you still going to test for marijuana if recreational is now approved in your state? Is it acceptable even to test now for marijuana in your state? Some states like New York and Nevada, you can't even exclude someone from employment if they fail a pre-employment drug test for marijuana. So again, know your state laws, really. HR folks, you've got to have that saved on your browser tab, your revised statute. So look at that on what are you going to do for pre-employment? What are you going to do for random? What are you going to do for after post-work testing? Those kinds of things. And work with your industrial occupation injury clinic, and you'll need to change any tests if you don't want to have marijuana on your panel any longer. Or maybe you do, but only on certain panels for post-accident or a reasonable suspicion or random, but not pre-employment. So work through that. And then you still want to keep all of the specific logistics in there of, what substances do you test for? What do you do if you get a positive test result? Where do you send them, and how is the chain of custody of information? How is that shared? Do you keep the results confidential, as I, recommend you do? And then what do you do when you get a positive test? Because I've had, again, in healthcare specifically, we've had issues with, if someone tests positive for meth and someone tests positive for marijuana, can you treat them differently? Well, I have found, at least through an unemployment appeals court, that yes, you can. And as long as you're consistent. So we had decided that meth was just too dangerous of a substance. We were not going to give a second chance to anyone who tested positive for methamphetamines. And then for folks that tested positive, maybe on a reasonable suspicion or a random test for marijuana at that time, and they weren't in a safety sensitive position, we did a second chance for them and gave them, an accommodation.
How does this relate to our volunteer workforce?
Mm-hmm. Good question.
Great question.
Good question. Wow.
So same kind of thing. If it's federally funded, I would test your volunteers, and if they're in an area federally funded, I would not allow them to work in that area. I would reassign them to another area as well.
Could you have, Tara, these are all just really curious questions, but none of this was planned. It's just from our conversation. Could you have them, instead of like going through the expense of testing, for them to like provide an optional yay or nay? I mean, clearly if they have a medical card, they know that, and they, might be a little bit more willing to admit. And then even with recreational, I feel it's become much more socially acceptable now that there's so many states that really do have this, this law in place. I'm just thinking cost when it comes to the cost of our nonprofits. Could we have an individual staff or volunteer, just, I don't know, like volunteer to say that you don't need to test me on this. I will tell you that I use marijuana.
There's a couple options, a couple of ways you could go about this. So whether it's staff or volunteer, I would definitely disclose up front that you do require a drug test if you do. And here are the substances. You can share the whole policy with them. Because what happens when you send someone for a pre-employment or pre-volunteer screening, they might be testing for 5, 7, 9 different elements. So you're still probably going to want to test them. And they could test positive for prescription narcotics. And then those can be individually reviewed by the medical review officer at the clinic. And they can say, okay, send me a copy of the prescription label. And then they look at the test results and they say, yes, it's within acceptable range, or no, it's outside of acceptable range. So you might still want to send them no matter what. Okay. Another thing you could do too is you can do your own in-house testing. There are kits you can buy to test, and they have the different panel versions depending on what you want to test on. And you can do saliva, you can do urine cups, you can do breath alcohol strips. So sometimes that can bring it down. A lot of times folks will disclose if they use a controlled substance, they might say that. And then I would recommend them as an HR person in-house. I would say, take your prescription bottle with you to the clinic when you do the test, so that they can verify that. And you cannot ask them if they use marijuana. They can disclose to you, the employer, that they do use marijuana if they so choose. If they end up testing positive for marijuana, you can ask first, do you have a medical card? If so, you can request a copy of that, keep that in their file. For employees, it would be in their personal information file, not in their performance file. So make sure you're separating those out. And then for volunteers, you probably want to have a separate file too for any kind of health information.
So okay, one more question. Yeah. When does this apply? Because we have viewers of all size organization. So if they have 0 staff, maybe it's consultants that they work with, or, maybe they have 1 person, like when do these like policies and legal manners, when do they take place? Like I know for, like when you get hurt on the job, what is that?
Workers' comp.
Workers' comp. Isn't that for like one, like you just have to have 1 person and then you're required to have that policy? Like, so when does this come into play?
When you wrap it up as a safety issue, I would do it for 1 person, especially if you're federally funded. They're gonna want to see that you have these policies in place, even if you're a one-stop shop. Now, if you're not receiving federally funds, or you're not a super safety, healthcare, social services related agency, I'd like to learn more about what their business is, what the programs are. So they may need to be bigger.
Right.
But, it seems to me like these policies at this point in time are somewhat boilerplated in terms of like the legal term, where you would say, how do I go and get started so that I'm not having to craft these things because I'm not an attorney? What are you recommending? I love that you said, talk with your insurance carrier. I think that's brilliant because you probably, that's the front line, right? First and foremost, but what are some other ways that, to Jarrett's point, some of our smaller nonprofits that don't even have legal representation can start to pull these things together?
Right. And employment law attorneys can be expensive. I work with a lot of them, and they're usually my last resort. So I am the queen of trying to find information cheap or free. So besides your workers or your carriers, your insurance carriers, you can also ask your brokers. A lot of times they provide free portal access to all kinds of tools and templates. So not just your work comp broker, but also your employment practices liability broker might have tools they can share with you. If your HR person or whoever is responsible for the HR function in your organization, if you get them a SHRM national source, they subscription or membership, there's a lot of templates available there as
Okay.
well. And hopefully most nonprofits have a lot of these in place. They just need to be tweaked. And there's a couple I want to make sure that nonprofits do look at. Besides the separate drug and alcohol policy that's going to share all of the procedural and all the nitty-gritty details in it, look at your employee handbook. That might also have at least a mention of other safety policies, or your work comp or safety sensitive positions, how those are designated. There might be reference to that in there. So check that as well. Then you might have safety policies by department, by the whole organization, or down by team or job position. So look at those. And the other one was look at make sure. What's the other one? So the Americans with Disability Act, and do you need to provide reasonable accommodation to someone who uses medical marijuana? And, probably you can't reasonably accommodate them if they're in a safety sensitive, federally funded position. However, again, if they're a desk jockey in a non-federally funded position, not in direct contact with clients, you probably should go through the interactive process and see if you can accommodate them as well.
I love how this rolls so like eloquently off your tongue, but I don't think I've ever said these words put together. So it's safety sensitive, federally funded position.
Yes. I've had my coffee, so
that's really good. And one of the policies, and Julia knows that this is big for me, that I want us to talk about at some point, not during this episode, is how do we as fundraisers and leaders of organizations, how do we work with these dispensaries, which is essentially what they're called, when it comes to their corporate social responsibility, right? So are we changing our gift acceptance policy? Are we willing to work with these dispensaries as they become more active and prominent in our communities? What if they want to be a title sponsor of your next gala, right? Are we prepared to engage in these corporate partnerships? So that's a whole nother ball of wax that I want us to talk about and scratch the surface at some point.
Well, it's really an important thing because, think about just the alcohol partnerships, from beer and wine and hard spirits. That was very, very controversial when you started having two parts. You started having nonprofits have wine auction, spirits kind of events, to those organizations wanting to come in and sponsor things. There's still a lot of organizations that are not comfortable with that.
Yeah.
It's a big topic. And Jared, I'm thrilled that you brought that up because that is something definitely.
Well, I grew up in the Carolinas, so South Carolina, and North Carolina is known really for its tobacco growth. And so I was really part of those conversations in the Carolinas of, will we accept money from, tobacco growers, and maybe if you're, a heart, lung, or, a health and wellness organization, it may actually not align with your mission. So it's really a case by case scenario, really to consider.
Wow. Tara, this is amazing. And I'm so appreciative that you would come on and share your knowledge, because I know this is such a changing thing. And now we have a federal administration change, a presidential administration change, which is probably going to impact a lot of federal discussion on some of these things moving forward. Give me the number of states again, right? But as we close out, what was the number you started with us with in terms of the number of states that are now adopting legal versus recreational, and both?
35 have medical marijuana approved, and 15 plus DC have medical plus recreational. And then can I just add a couple more quick things before we wrap up? I just want to make sure if any folks are taking notes, they get these last few little tidbits. So one thing with when you drug test for marijuana, the tests are not sophisticated enough, at least not the affordable ones, for organizations to know what is the impairment level. Like if you do a breath alcohol screening, you can see 0.04, 0.06, 0.08, 1.0, those kinds of things. Marijuana doesn't have such a test yet. So the important thing for managers, if they are suspecting, have a reasonable suspicion because of odor, bloodshot eyes, sleepiness, paranoia, anxiety, some of those traditional symptoms of marijuana usage. If they see those and want to send someone for the test, they need to really clearly document all of those things, because they won't be able to get that real finite marijuana impairment.
Right.
The other item I like to suggest that nonprofits move towards is really talk about the warnings of using recreational marijuana and alcohol, and abusing prescription drugs in the drug and alcohol policy, and then list your EAP information and list counseling services as well. There's a lot of national hotline resources out there.
EAP.
Employee
EAP, Employee
Program.
Assistance Program.
Yeah.
Usually free. Usually they throw it in with your life insurance employer paid program. So talk to your brokers to get a free one, and then offer that, and constantly remind your employees, because they do more than alcohol and substance abuse, but it's there for them. Nonprofit workers, they work so hard. So keep sharing those free resources with them.
Yeah, and it's often, a crisis and trauma, situation in which we work often. I've personally taken advantage of my employer's EAP previously, and it was just so helpful, especially as many of us talk about having a reduced salary, like many of our nonprofit workforce is still paycheck to paycheck. So that's a great benefit to have. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, Tara. Thank you.
Sure.
Wow. Well, Tara, you have been, again, amazing. I always love when we get a chance to chat. And here's Tara's information. You're a super smart woman who is very calm, very practical, very precise. And I really appreciate that, because so many of these things can quickly devolve into like an emotional conversation. And I loved how you started it off today. This is not a discussion whether you like it or not, or you participate or not. It's the discussion of how this is integrating into our workforce. It's the reality.
Thanks for having me, ladies.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
It's really given me a lot to think about. Again, I'm Julia Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. I'm joined today by my wonderful co-host, the nonprofit nerd herself, Jarrett Ransom. Jarrett, I loved your conversation point about the gift policy. So we will march on that and drill down on that, because that's a really important topic. So yay, team. You are the nonprofit nerd.
Do what I can, but when I think of fundraising, I mean, that's really my strategy, or I should say my wheelhouse is strategy and fundraising. So glad we talked about it on the HR perspective. And then I think there's so much more to discuss as we continue to integrate it into our community and our sector.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I really, really do. Hey, again, we want to thank our presenting sponsors. Without you, we would not have this amazing discussion. And yes, as Jarrett mentioned, we are coming up upon our 200th episode. I'm like, that blows my mind.
I can't believe it.
Oh my God.
It's like December 21st or something. So we still have a few more days.
Yeah. And we still have a lot to talk about. So that's really exciting. And our sponsors have allowed us to do that. Hey, this has been another great episode of the Nonprofit Show. We're so delighted you joined us. Tara Bethel, you're a goddess. We are super appreciative. And as we end every show, we like to say, stay well so you can do well.